we should get started, and I'll just start with a quick introduction, just to say, first of all, thank you, Jim, for agreeing to give a talk. For everybody's kind of information, I never actually met Jim. We in person, we've communicated a little bit recently on email, but his name kept popping up in every conversation, and we have a lot of people, friends and collaborators in common, from Anne-Marie, who's now joining us soon at the Institute, to Dave Rand, Molly Crockett, to who else? Azim Sharif, that's right. So it seems like we're kind of our meeting is delayed if you take triadic closure probability into account. But I'm very glad that we have an opportunity now to listen to you talk. So Jim is a lecturer at the University of Kent, and he spent basically all of his education at Oxford, bachelor's, master's, and PhD. He did his PhD with Molly Crockett, who is the advisor of Anne-Marie and Asperger as well. And he spent some time during his PhD at Yale and Harvard, and then did a postdoc stint in the Netherlands. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, in Leiden in the Netherlands before I moved here.
Yeah, so lots of really interesting work and kind of especially on the foundations of moral reasoning. And I think, even though we're interested very much in applications, we want to have a solid foundation in the latest thinking. For example, I've been following the debates on, what are the moral foundations? Are they 5 dimensions or 7 or 2? So I'm really looking forward to this talk. So without further ado, Jim, please go ahead. And how would you like to take questions? Would you be open to questions, like quick questions, clarifying questions during the talk?
Yeah, quick clarifying questions. I might say I'll come back to this later. Okay. And some of them, it might be that I think it's, maybe we can discuss it more at the end. But yeah, feel free to jump in with questions.
Okay, sounds good. And just as a protocol, if anybody has a question, please just jump in during the talk. But then for the questions at the end, if you could just type question in the chat, and then that will act as the first come first serve, basically queue.
Great.
Great. Yeah, please go ahead, Jim. Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Thank you so much. So hi everyone. So thank you very much for that introduction, for having me here today. So I'm going to be talking about some work that I've been doing on what I'm calling the 2-dimensional model of utilitarian psychology. And I'm going to start and not end with thank yous, because of course none of this work I've really done. I haven't done any of it on my own. And I've been deeply influenced and supported and helped by my wonderful collaborators at Oxford. So Guy Kahane and Julian Savulescu, who are both philosophers, and Molly Crockett, who was one of my PhD supervisors. And so each of these people has had a very, very strong role in all of this work today. So thank you very much to them. So the trolley problem. I'm sure that you've all seen this, you all know it, but it would be remiss if I were to ever start a talk in which I didn't go over it. A trolley is hurtling down the tracks towards 5 people. You're standing on a footbridge and you can push one amply sized man off the bridge so that his substantial girth is going to stop the train or the tram and save the 5 people. Should you push? Should you not? Utilitarianism is one ethical theory that has distinctive answers to this approach. Classical utilitarianism, which is the kind of utilitarianism that we focus on in moral psychology, is associated with scholars like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and can be contrasted with deontological approaches associated with scholars like Kant. And utilitarianism gives distinctive answers. And it says that for the whole of morality, we can deduce what is right or wrong from a single general principle, that we should always act in a way that impartially maximizes aggregate well-being. In essence, we need to weigh up the consequences of any action. If an action has positive, impartial consequences, then it's good. If it doesn't have good consequences, then it's bad. And so in this trolley problem, utilitarianism gives a distinctive answer that we should push the one man, we should sacrifice him, we should instrumentally harm him in order to save the five. Much work in moral psychology, as you all know, has focused on these kinds of problems. And while the trolley problem is a very unusual and artificial kind of moral dilemma, the underlying principles are very generalizable. For example, is it acceptable to abort a child if it's going to cause severe harm or even kill the mother? Is it acceptable to inflict harm on animals for experimentation? Is it acceptable to kill a terrorist if doing so will hurt innocent people in their vicinity? And as you all know, especially we can see this in these kind of self-driving cars, autonomous vehicle type dilemmas exemplified in the moral machine. Clearly, these sacrificial dilemmas play an important role in everyday life. And of course, now we're in COVID land, which raises its own dilemmas. For example, who do we prioritize with ventilators? Is it acceptable to eliminate rights to privacy to track and trace individuals, and so on? Now, one very dominant theory in neuropsychology, the dual process model, has focused on these kinds of dilemmas and said that there are two systems that support moral decision making. There's this automatic and emotionally grounded system that favors deontological decisions, and there's this deliberative reasoning system that supports utilitarian decisions. Process underlying deontological decisions that don't push is assumed to be automatic, effective, and resource independent, while the process underlying utilitarian responses is assumed to be deliberative, cognitive, and effortful. And the idea is that in sacrificial dilemmas, these systems render competing motives, and that this causes a response conflict that we use deliberation to solve. And a key part of this model, at least in its earlier forms, is this normative blend, moving from a descriptive claim about how we reason about these trolley dilemmas to how we should think about ethics more generally. So in its most ambitious form, the dual process model claims not just that utilitarian pro-sacrificial decisions are almost uniquely cognitive, but that these processes apply beyond the context of sacrificial dilemmas. And it's claimed that actually the philosophical debate between utilitarians and deontological opponents can itself be explained in terms of the dual process model. So Green, for example, writes, the terms deontology and consequentialism refer to psychological natural kinds, i.e. there's something real in the brain, and that this is because they're philosophical manifestations of two dissociable psychological patterns, two different ways of moral thinking. And because one is more driven by deliberation and reason, and one is more impacted by intuitive heuristics, the idea is that this provides support for utilitarianism as a normative ethical theory. I argue that sacrificial dilemmas are just one piece of the puzzle. It's not a small piece. It's a fairly significantly sized, it's a plus size piece of the puzzle, but it is still only one piece of the puzzle. And that to understand utilitarian moral psychology, let alone to make these normative claims, we need to consider the whole picture. So utilitarianism from its very beginnings has been a highly radical progressive view. So originating with Jeremy Bentham and his close successor John Stuart Mill in Victorian England, it's now associated predominantly with the Australian philosopher Peter Singer. And at a time when women had no rights, I think at this point they are still legally property of their husband, when homosexuals can be imprisoned or executed, when we still export petty criminals to Australia, which is a terrible fate, these radically progressive individuals were arguing for animal rights, the precursors of gay rights, of women's rights, It was and continues to be a radically progressive ethical movement, which says that we need to focus on the greatest good for the greatest number, moving beyond our kind of heuristic concerns or locally based moral judgments to think about the good of the universe, of people as a whole, to make moral decisions from the standpoint of the universe. And utilitarianism, its core idea has a lot of progressive implications. So, for example, Peter Singer has been one of the key figures in this animal rights, animal liberation movement, in which he argues on utilitarian grounds that we need to expand the moral circle to include animals. And this goes back to the very start of utilitarianism with Jeremy Bentham. And he writes, a civilized society must count animals as worthy of moral consideration and ethical treatment. The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Similarly, utilitarianism differs from standard common sense moral approaches in not just how much it tells us to donate, but to whom. So Peter Singer has this wonderful book, The Life You Can Save, and utilitarian principles have been an important precursor to effective altruist movement, which suggests that we need to do more to help people. We need to give more to charity, but we also need to do that in the most effective way, that we need to think about where our money can do the most good and how we can play our required part in ending world poverty. One of the examples that Peter Singer uses here that is relevant later is the shallow pond case. So Peter Singer writes, imagine that on a walk one day, you go past a shallow pond. You notice a child has fallen in and appears to be drowning. To wade in and pull the child out would be easy, but it means that your clothes will be ruined. Do you have any obligation to rescue the child? Now, most of us would say yes. I mean, I certainly hope that we would. If a child is drowning in front of us and we can help them at a minimal cost to ourselves, just ruining our clothes, we should do that. Now, he says, in a foreign country, a small child is very close to dying of malnutrition. For less than the cost of your clothes, you could donate money and save the child. Are you morally required to do so? And now most people tend to say no, that they don't perceive that they're morally obligated to do this. And of course, most people don't do this. And Peter Singer writes that once we're clear about our obligations to rescue the drowning child, he asks, would it make any difference if the child were far away, in another country perhaps, but similarly in danger of death and equally within your means to save? He goes on to write, we are all in that situation of the person passing the shallow pond. We can all save the lives of people, both children and adults, who would otherwise die, and we can do so at a very small cost to ourselves. The cost of a new CD, a shirt, a night out at a restaurant or concert. This can mean the difference between life and death to more than one person somewhere in the world. And this, I think, is really at the core of Peter Singer's approach to ethics. It's this radically progressive, radically demanding approach to ethics. And indeed, that's one of the key criticisms of utilitarianism, that it's too demanding. It asks too much of us mere mortals in the ethical domain. This is what I call impartial beneficence. The extent to which individuals endorse the impartial promotion of everyone's welfare without regard to distance or personal ties. And so in work with Guy Kahane and Julian Savulescu, we've been arguing that there needs to be a greater attention paid to impartial beneficence, to this more progressive, positive component of utilitarianism. In our most recent paper, Intrinsic Cognitive Science, we phrased two questions. The internal content question, which is, in sum, is there a meaningful relationship between pro-sacrificial judgments and the processes that cause them with what's distinctive of utilitarianism generally? And the second one is this generalizability question. And that's really what I'm going to focus on today. And the generalizability question is whether we can generalize from these studies using sacrificial dilemmas to try and understand utilitarian psychology writ large. Can the same models, the same approaches that help us understand why people are willing to push a fat man off the bridge, help us understand how people are going to think about animal rights, the obligations to donate more to charity, to act impartially, of what we call impartial beneficence. Now, at this point, you might say, okay, well, you can ask whether they generalize, but is this even important? Does anyone even claim that they're likely to generalize? And they do. And it's actually a fairly important part of the dual process model. So Green, for example, writes, the same psychological theory that makes sense of the trolley problem can make sense of Singer's pond problem. Conway and colleagues write, these trolley dilemmas do little to win utilitarianism quick converts. Nevertheless, understanding the psychology behind these intuitive objections, that is to the trolley problem, may be an essential step towards defending utilitarian thinking and its more recognizably moral commitments, that is impartial beneficence. And Patil and colleagues write, the present manuscript involves many studies of instrumental harm, but no direct study of impartial beneficence. Thus, our results hold implications for individual differences in impartial beneficence only indirectly. So this idea that findings on instrumental harm would generalize to this more recognizably moral impartial beneficence is a claim that's often made, and it's made because part of the motivation behind the dual process model isn't just to explain the trolley problem. It started trying to understand the switch versus footbridge case, but it's transcended now into a more general theory of moral judgment, a theory of moral judgment that doesn't just seek to explain sacrificial dilemmas, but to explain moral judgment writ large, and specifically to explain utilitarianism. And this is important because if, as proponents of the dual process model might want to claim that we can draw these normative conclusions from it, it's important that the findings do generalize, because it's difficult to make claims about how we should act in the basis of impartial beneficence from empirical work on instrumental harm if there isn't that generalizability. And so the key idea that I'm arguing is that there are two distinct components of utilitarianism. There's this two-dimensional model. One is instrumental harm and one is impartial beneficence. And my concern is that we've done a whole body of really amazing work. People sometimes like to characterize me as kind of just raining on the sacrificial dilemma parade. And I really don't think that. There has been an amazing amount of excellent work that has helped us understand the psychological processes, the individual differences, what is happening with sacrificial dilemmas. My concern is that we can't then just assume that this is going to apply to impartial beneficence, because what happens is you kind of end up with a picture that looks a little bit like this. We've got this very detailed, intricate picture on the left of instrumental harm, and really nothing at all on the right-hand side. I mean, and this is assuming that this is even a horse. We don't even know if utilitarianism is a unitary psychological phenomenon. We should be drawing a centaur or a unicorn. There's no guarantee that what is on the right is going to be the same animal, the same thing as on the left. Slightly weird, torturous analogy. Using this for the first time, we'll see if I use this again. But I like the picture. So the basic roadmap, the too long, didn't read or didn't listen, as it were, of this talk. So if you're bored and you want to tune out now, you can, because this is really the key part of my talk. Much work has studied the moral psychology of utilitarian judgment using sacrificial dilemmas that tap instrumental harm. But there's another key dimension of utilitarianism, impartial beneficence, and that there's little evidence of generalizability between the two dimensions. They seem to have different patterns of associated individual differences. They seem to rely on different processes, and they have distinct consequences for social perception. To understand utilitarian psychology, I argued that we have to take a multidimensional approach. So first, individual differences. So in this work that I started actually as a master's student in this joint first authored paper with Guy Kahane, which I believe was actually the handling editor was Jean-Francois, if I remember back correctly. We started to look at whether utilitarian judgments in sacrificial dilemmas do generalize or reflect an impartial concern for the greater good. So in study one, we kind of replicate this previously found Bartels and Pizarro and many others finding that endorsement of sacrificial decisions is associated with psychopathy and actually unambiguous ethical violations in a business context. Because that's not terribly novel and interesting. The more novel thing was to look at whether sacrificial decisions were associated with these more prototypical markers of a genuine utilitarian approach to ethics. So, and we didn't find that they do. So we found that utilitarian judgment was actually associated with endorsement of rational egoism, the idea that what is rational is only that which serves one's own benefit. It's associated with ethical egoism, the idea that what's ethical is only what benefits myself. Sacrificial decisions were associated with less donation of money to charity and less identification with the whole of humanity. We then tried to craft some dilemmas that were somewhat akin to the sacrificial dilemmas, but mapping this more impartial beneficence, although we didn't use that term here. So for example, one dilemma that we use is Benjamin is a college student who's always wanted to have his own car. He works after school jobs, he saves all his money, and he rarely goes out. He saves $7,000. On his way to the used car dealership, he reads about a tsunami in Southeast Asia that's left thousands dead, wounded, and homeless. A number is given where donations can be processed to help these victims. Benjamin knows that if he were to donate a significant amount to this charity, his donation would make a real difference to the lives of these victims. How wrong would it be for Benjamin to go and buy the car rather than donate the money? So according to utilitarianism, it would be wrong for him to go and buy the car because he wouldn't be maximizing aggregate well-being. Another example, which I'm not going to go into for time, concerned Mark, who has basically decided that he's going to give £1,000 to charity, and he's just deciding whether he's going to donate to a charity in his own country or a more effective charity that would save the lives of a greater number of children in a distant foreign country. And again, utilitarianism, the Peter Singer style argument, would say that he must donate the money to the charity in the foreign country that will save the lives of more children. And so what we found across 4 studies was that the tendency to endorse the sacrifice of one person, this instrumental harm, was not associated or even negatively associated with these paradigmatic markers of a utilitarian concern for the greater good. This negative correlation or lack of correlation remained even after we controlled for the antisocial component of utilitarian judgment. And so we suggested that studying sacrificial dilemmas is unlikely to tell us much about utilitarianism in general. So then 3 years later, a good friend of mine and academic nemesis, Paul Conway writes this paper directly responding to us. So whereas our claim is that sacrificial decisions do not reflect an impartial concern for the greater good, their paper is a direct response to ours, saying that sacrificial utilitarian judgments do reflect a concern for the greater good. And so they have 2 responses. They have a conceptual response that's to do with what it means to describe something as utilitarian, and we go into that in our most recent Trends in Cognitive Science paper. I'm going to focus here on the empirical response. And this comes from Paul's excellent work on process dissociation. And this is the idea that conventional dilemma analysis don't distinguish between a utilitarian tendency to maximize good outcomes and the absence of deontological concerns about causing harm. And so the idea is that you give participants a whole bunch of different dilemmas that vary on these slightly different ways, and then you do some fancy maths, And then you get these different parameters. There's a D parameter or a deontological parameter, and a U parameter or a utilitarian parameter. And then you kind of filter out the psychopaths who just want to cause harm. And so he argues in this 2018 paper that when you use process dissociation, you can identify people who make pro-sacrificial judgments because they have a concern for the greater good, not because they just want to cause harm. They therefore argue that sacrificial utilitarian judgments do reflect a concern for the greater good. They suggest that sacrificial utilitarian judgments do generalize to these more prototypical forms of utilitarianism. But I think one problem here is what we've called the internal content problem. So it's not clear that what is going on in this PDU parameter is meaningfully reflective of utilitarianism. So first thing is that these analyses show that indifference to harm is actually a stronger driver of pro-sacrificial choices than concern for outcomes. Second, process dissociation measures this greater concern for better outcomes, but the thing is nearly all moral theories say that you should save more lives rather than fewer lives. Utilitarianism is distinctive in two ways here. So the first way it's distinctive is in how many. So utilitarianism says that we should sacrifice one person to save two, that we should sacrifice 49 people to save 50 people. And there's no evidence from process dissociation or any other analyses suggesting that people make these judgments. And in fact, there's evidence that they don't, for example, from Jean-Francois. The second is that there's differences in who to help. So there's no evidence that the PDU parameter is associated with greater impartiality. And so I think that the process dissociation U parameter is utilitarian only in a qualified sense. And my hunch is that I think that Paul Conway does agree here. And in more recent work, he does call this outcome maximization parameter in this effort to not have this confusion. But I do think there's still this generalizability problem. So while they replicated our results as well as doing process dissociation, and while this isn't so much the focus, what they do find is that actually the U parameter, like the conventional analyses, is actually uncorrelated, or again, even negatively correlated with the impartial beneficence. So with the greater good dilemmas, with the other measures that we use there to measure impartial beneficence. So even when we use process dissociation to try and filter out the people who are psychopaths, you still don't see this generalizability from the U parameter, from the utilitarianism to impartial beneficence. And in fact, they actually write that their findings suggest that the U parameter tracks a commitment to the local minimization of harm rather than a global pursuit of the greater good that goes beyond conventional expectations. But of course, the global pursuit of the greater good that goes beyond conventional expectations is actually utilitarianism. That's kind of the key idea, that it goes beyond what common sense morality says and is much more radically impartial and demanding. And so while the kind of the title of the paper and the general way that it's cited in response to our original paper is that the sacrificial utilitarian judgments do reflect a concern for the greater good, I don't think that we can, I think that this depends on what we mean by the greater good. If we mean greater good in terms of this impartial beneficence claim that we were originally studying, then I don't think we can make that claim. That despite this evidence, it's not clear that findings on instrumental harm generalize to impartial beneficence. So following this, we wanted to kind of write a review. So this is a paper published in Psychological Review, but we also wanted to develop this new scale that would help understand utilitarianism, and in doing so, help to understand the structure of this. So what we did is we gave participants a whole, I think it was about 83 different statements that were drawn from consultation with philosophers and psychologists, from previous literature, some new ones. And we basically did a big scale development factor analysis project in which we found that two distinct subscales were emerged, one which very strongly tracked instrumental harm and one which very strongly tracked this concept of impartial beneficence, and that these were only weakly correlated and sometimes they were negatively correlated, and that this two-dimensional model fit all the data significantly better than a unidimensional model in which they're all clustered together. Now, interestingly, while they appear distinct in the lay population, our confirmatory validation with philosophers who took the scale, philosophers including Peter Singer, showed that while lay people who are higher on instrumental harm tend to be lower on impartial beneficence and vice versa, for philosophers, they actually do tend to go together, which was an interesting finding that kind of emerged from this validation, which the idea was really just to show that people who self-identify as utilitarians would score highest on the scale, which they did. So that's an interesting direction that we still want to study a little bit more. What is it that makes philosophers or ethical experts bring the two together? Is it just an act of coherence? Is it that people, that small subset who are attracted to both dimensions end up adopting utilitarianism and then slightly more cohere? It's not clear what's happening here. And so we also show that the two findings have significantly different patterns of individual differences. So instrumental harm is associated with reduced empathic concern, increased political conservatism, increased psychopathy, and the endorsement of unethical business practices, while impartial beneficence is associated with increased empathic concern, reduced political conservatism, increased identification with all humanity, increased concern for future generations, and religiosity. And together we argue that this work shows that the two dimensions are conceptually distinct, psychologically distinct, and have different psychological correlates. And we haven't done as much on the processes. This is still a fairly new model. I mean, the psych review paper in which we developed the scale and everything only came out 2 years ago. But we've done some work on the processes underlying. So this paper by Valerio Capraro and me and Brian Earp, which is great actually. I was at the SPSP conference and I was staying with Valerio Capraro. We were renting an Airbnb together. And I went to a talk in the morning and I came back and he said, Jim, I ran a study on your OUS study. And I was like, what? And he'd run study one of this and then was like, would you please join me? And the idea behind this is that there's work showing that in instrumental harm, in sacrificial dilemmas, it's strongly affected in line with the dual process model by things like time pressure or cognitive load or cognitive priming. And we were interested in if whether we gave a similar manipulation to participants, whether we would see the same findings on impartial beneficence or whether they would yield a different pattern. So we did 3 studies and 2 pre-registered in which we manipulated cognitive process through conceptual priming of intuition versus reason, and then gave participants the OUS. So for example, to prime intuition, in one study we said, many people believe that intuition leads to good decision making. Whether something feels right is often a good indication of whether it is right. And that when we rely on automatic gut feelings instead of logic, we often make better decisions. While other participants were told, many people believe that reason leads to good decision making, that whether something is rational and makes logical sense is often a good indication of whether it's right. And what we found is that we replicated the previously found work on sacrificial dilemmas in instrumental harm. So completely in line with the predictions of the dual process theory, in line with previous work, when you encourage participants to rely on deliberation over intuition, then you saw an increased number of utilitarian decisions in the domain of instrumental harm, but there was no difference for impartial beneficence, suggesting that the processes do seem to be different between the two dimensions of utilitarianism, that we can't just generalize from instrumental harm to impartial beneficence. And in the last 10 minutes or so, in this whistle-stop tour, I'm going to give a very, very quick overview of some of this work on social perceptions, including the most newest work that's been consuming my life for the last 7 months and is a hole that I fear I may never fully come out of. I see that there are questions coming in the chat. Are these questions for now or later?
I believe these are questions for later, so it's fine.
Okay, great, cool. Okay, thanks for clarifying. So work from social psychology has shown that there are 3 key dimensions on which we can judge other people. So we can think about someone's warmth. Does someone seem like a sociable, extroverted person? We can think about someone's competence. Do they seem like an intelligent, capable person? And we can think about their morality. Do they seem like a good, trustworthy person? And a growing body of work suggests that it's really morality that dominates in-person perception, that people are more concerned with appearing moral and trustworthy than warm or competent, that they seek out information about someone's warmth more than, about someone's morality rather than warmth or competence, and that information about warmth is seen as just generally more important. But of course, as we've seen today, there are many different ways in which someone can show their morality that give completely different decisions in these moral dilemmas. People can justify a whole host of different things, competing actions in moral terms. And so in particular, we were interested in how people who endorse sacrificial harm in these trolley dilemmas were perceived and whether that would be a cue for trust. This is all very, very quick because usually I would give a whole talk kind of going over this. And I really just want to get to the second part. So in this work with Molly Crockett and Dave Pizarro, we were looking at the social perceptions that come from endorsement of sacrificial harm. So we gave participants like the trolley dilemma, and we said, hey, here's a trolley dilemma. What do you think? Is it right or wrong? And we then said, now you're going to interact with someone else. And this other person also saw the trolley problem. And they said, killing people is just wrong, even if it has good consequences. They said, don't push. Or they said, yes, you should push, but it's better to save 5 lives rather than 1. We then had them rate the person's morality and trust, and we had them play an economic trust game to get a behavioral indicator of how much they trusted the person. And what we found is that the person who rejected the sacrifice was seen as significantly more moral and trustworthy than the utilitarian, and that they received more transfers in the trust game, and they were predicted to return more in the trust game. Now, this paper is actually very long, and a big part of it is actually going through how different flavors of deontological approaches differentially influence trust. So I'm really only talking here about study 1. And there is a lot more, like where we compare the switch case and other cases and contractualist versus Kantian deontological approaches. But this is all I'm going to say about it here for now. To bring me to this second work, which again with Molly and this time with Nadira Faber and Julian Savulescu, in which we said, okay, so there's this work on harming for the greater good and how we infer character from those sort of decisions. What about from helping for the greater good? And so we gave participants in a similar design with this setup, but now we use a greater good dilemma. So you're interacting with someone who says that she should, in this dilemma about she's got some money and she needs to decide whether to give to her grandson because he needs his car fixed or to donate to charity, the person that participants interacting with gives either a characteristically deontological or utilitarian decision in this impartial beneficence dilemma. We then measure a whole bunch of different things, which I'm speeding through for time. And basically what we find is that we always replicated our findings on sacrificial dilemmas across the 4 studies, all pre-registered, bigger sample sizes, more measures. We found that people who made the deontological or non-utilitarian decision in sacrificial dilemmas were favored, but that there was a very different pattern for impartial beneficence, that the social perceptions from instrumental harm didn't generalize to the social perceptions from impartial beneficence. And most intriguingly, we found that while there did seem to be similarity between sacrificial dilemma or instrumental harm and impartial beneficence in how we judge someone's suitability as a friend, there seemed to be this opposite pattern when it came to suitability as a political leader, with a suggestion in some of the studies, but not all, that participants actually preferred someone who made an impartial beneficence judgment, and they thought that they'd be a better political leader. So we publish this, I go away and I get a small grant from the British Academy to look precisely at this, to understand how moral decisions in moral dilemmas shape reactions to political leaders. So we start this, and then ready to kind of start really planning this and getting on in like late February. I then go to SPSP, end of February, start of March, and then I get back, and then we're kind of in this massive hellscape that COVID has created. So I was talking to Molly and I was like, oh my God, you know, this is really stressful. But then we're like, actually, this is just a perfect way to study this question that we were interested in how political leaders are judged for their decisions in these kind of moral dilemmas, not just about instrumental harm, but in impartial beneficence. And so these dilemmas really have played out. So Peter Singer, for example, in the New York Times Magazine, made arguments, you know, quite controversially at the time, because this was before the anti-lockdown rhetoric got a bit larger. I think this was April or so, that he was actually saying that Trump was correct when Trump said that we can't let the cure be worse than the disease. That he said, you know, we need to consider the trade-off. And he said that he thinks that the assumption that we just need to reduce number of deaths is not the right assumption. He actually argued for relieving of lockdown for the greater good. He was endorsing instrumental harm. But of course, at the same time, political leaders, especially in the US, who were making this decision, were subject to massive criticism, like the person who said that, you know, we should just let grandparents die, and that they would be happy to die for the benefit of their children's welfare in future years. But of course, there are other dilemmas in which this is coming out. There's ventilators, there's questions about track and trace, and there's these impartial beneficence dilemmas that we're seeing, especially now with the vaccine. Do you keep medicine and vaccine within your own country to benefit your own citizens, or do you spread it impartially around the world, for example, to countries that have less developed health infrastructure and where the consequences of the pandemic could be much more severe than they might be in less sparsely populated, wealthy Western countries? And so we've been working on this in a registered report that's now accepted as a stage 1 at Nature Human Behavior. Joint first authored with Clara Colombatto, and Molly is the senior author. Also, Eddie Awad, who I'm sure you will know, has been working on us with this. And the idea is that we were using this global health crisis to try and understand how moral dilemmas shape trust in leaders. And so we have a bunch of different dilemmas, some instrumental harm, for example, lockdown. should we reopen or stay closed? Ventilators, whether you should prioritize younger people or give everyone equal access. And then some impartial beneficence dilemmas. So send who needs it most versus prioritize the home country. And so we're giving participants they're judging these purported political leaders who are making utilitarian or non-utilitarian judgments in these dilemmas and justifying this with characteristic utilitarian or non-utilitarian reasons. For example, in the ventilators, the utilitarian says, we have to think about how we can do the most good with the resources we have, and that means prioritizing those people who have the best chance of recovering and living a long and healthy life. Whereas the non-utilitarian says, it's not our place to choose who lives. Everyone has the same right to receive equal access to treatment, and we can't abandon our most vulnerable in an effort to save more lives. And then we have impartial beneficence, for example, in medicine. The utilitarian says COVID-19 is a global pandemic that affects all humans equally. We need to be impartial and send treatment where it can achieve the greatest good. Whereas a non-utilitarian says we have a right to use our own resources to help our own citizens before everyone else. Other countries can produce their own treatments for COVID-19. And so we have a self-report task where participants just indicate how much they trust the leader, both on as a person and how much they trust them more generally on other issues. We also have this novel voting task to try and again get a behavioral measure. So this has two stages. First, we have a separate group of participants, the donors, and we just gave them $1, and we said, you can have $1 as a bonus. What percent of that bonus do you want to donate to UNICEF? So then the main participants in our study then have this decision in the task. They have to vote for a leader who's responsible for the group donation. So this leader has the money that the donors have given, and we will pay that leader that's voted for that bonus of, I think it's around $120. And then that person, that MTurker, has the choice of whether they keep that money for themselves or they do donate it to UNICEF as intended. And so participants in our task, they have to vote for which leader they want, which we thought kind of helps approximate the way that we vote for political leaders in the real world in this context that would work across all of the countries within the constraints of our resources and design. And then eventually the leader then decides how much they want to transfer to UNICEF versus keep for themselves. And we're doing this across 22 countries. So we've got mostly representative samples in all the countries. We're prioritizing power over representativeness, but in most of the countries, it's representative for age and gender and also race in some countries. And so we kind of said in the registered report that we would have a minimum of 12,600 for each task. So we've now met that for the self-report, and we're nearly there for the voting task. In total, we've got data from over 20,000 participants, and we're still collecting data. I haven't done the analysis yet because obviously we're not doing any data analysis until all the data comes in. But I can share with you the results of the pilot data, in which this is in the UK, I believe, because my face is currently blocking the bit where I say UK or US on the screen. We find that the leaders who make utilitarian judgments in instrumental harm are trusted less, but leaders who make utilitarian judgments in impartial beneficence are trusted more, replicating what we find in the JESP paper. And the same was found in this second pilot, which we report in the preprint registered report. The same is found in the US. So now it's kind of just like stay tuned, because we're collecting data and it should be finishing in the next week. and then we can do the data analysis, and then we can actually share. I was really hoping that I'd be able to share this with you, but there were some unexpected holdups at the reviewer end, and so we were kind of delayed by about 3 weeks. So we're actually about 3 weeks behind schedule where we thought we would be. And so I don't have the complete data, and because we haven't got the whole data, I can't share those results with you. But I think it's promising, and the key idea, I hope, is that it's going to help establish this, if the pilot results continue, that we can't just generalize from instrumental harm to impartial beneficence. And so that kind of the summary of my talk, that there are these two dimensions of utilitarianism, instrumental harm and impartial beneficence, that they have different patterns of individual correlates, they're conceptually distinct, they're psychologically distinct, they rely on different processes, and they seem to have different consequences for social perception. And so we need to be careful about assuming generalizability between these two dimensions when we're talking about utilitarianism, and instead consider specifically what kind of utilitarianism we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. This is fascinating. And I should say also that being 3 weeks behind schedule on such a big project sounds like a great outcome.
Thank you.
So we have some questions. The first question is from Jason. Jason, I know you've got 2 questions, so I will ask you to ask 1 question and then let Shabnam Musavi ask the second question, if that's okay, before you ask your second question. I'm just going here by the first come, first serve. Jason?
Should I just take the first question? Which
Jason,
one did you want?
Sorry, I just answered on the panel. Yeah, I'm fine with it.
Okay.
Go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, please. Or you could rephrase the question, Jason, if you like. You don't. Yeah. No need to write the full question in the chat.
So in regard to Dan, are you?
I'm fine with it. Just go ahead. I think that's how. I think mostly of the experiment you telling us and to a deontological concern come from. So is it between? Is it something arbitrary? Or is this case the man of the broom to save it? Some a little bit from the defined.
Thank you. So it was cutting out a little bit, but I think I got the gist of the question. So in general, so deontological theories are just a different kind of ethical theories as opposed to utilitarianism in ethics. So deontological theories, utilitarian theories say that what's moral is only what's dependent on the consequences, whereas deontological theories say that things other than consequences also matter, and these things are usually rights or duties. And so in the trolley problem, the dilemma, it kind of not arbitrarily, it deliberately sets up a contrast between the utilitarian and the deontological positions. But in real life, they do often kind of cohere to some degree, just because if we think of many ethical theories, they don't tend to say that things are morally good that everyone automatically or intuitively thinks of as bad. Like, we seem to have this intuitive sense of what's right or wrong, and arguably a good part of ethics is kind of systematizing that into a theory. And so deontological and utilitarian theories will often converge in many everyday cases, but the trolley dilemma is one such case that's deliberately used to specifically tease them apart, to, as you say, create these two hard choices where there isn't an easy answer.
So the deontological dilemma in this case would be, I don't want to have the bridge to harm another human being, for instance, something like that.
Exactly.
Versus
They would say
utilitarian, that it's the rational thing to do.
Exactly, yeah.
I see.
No problem. Sorry for not clarifying that at the start.
No worries. Yeah, I also didn't understand it well.
Okay, so Shabnam, next question.
Okay, hi Jim. Thanks for the talk. I like when people rain on that specific parade, so kudos. Now, when you talked about your paradigm, I was so waiting for a mention of roles. How come you have none of that veil of ignorance? And instead you're talking about Bentham. And then when you talk about Bentham, I kept waiting for talking about something like happiness as the ultimate greatest good, and then bringing in emotions in some form, then connecting to the ontic. On the comparison, and especially measuring comparatively between these two, one way of thinking about the final outcome that appeals to me better from psychology is that we go back and forth a lot. And actually neuroscience seems to agree with that. So how reliable this distinction would even be in whatever measurement we come out to specify its error bars. And finally, my point is more about measurements. Goes back to the beginning of your talk when you alluded to efficiency and effective interventions. In that, economists have a very clear way of thinking about it, which goes back to instrumental harm. I think they have been developed at the same time. But an engineer, when philosophers were talking about instrumental harm, started developing the notion of efficiency, famously Pareto. I'm sure you know about that. And then that would give you a way to operationalize this argument that you are having. I would love to know if you've given any of these any thoughts. Do you seem to find relevance to these things? And I stop here.
Thank you. Really interesting points. Thank you. So the first one, the reason that we focused, on Bentham rather than rules and that line of work is just that all the moral psychology work on kind of trolley dilemmas utilitarianism has focused explicitly on Bentham and classical utilitarianism. And there's rarely in this kind of work discussion of rules. Now, I do know that Josh Green, the promoter of this, has actually been doing some new work on the veil of ignorance and doing that kind of stuff. So, which is really interesting. But the reason that we're focusing on classical utilitarianism in correcting what we see as a potentially flawed narrative is that this narrative was about classical utilitarianism. So then the second point, we definitely don't think that people are committed utilitarians. Like, we do think that people will differ in different contexts and that it's not a stable thing. Like, it's very difficult to identify people as utilitarians, partly because there are these two dimensions, but also just because lay people don't think about morality in these concrete ways that is laid out by ethical theories. And so that's kind of why we think it's therefore unhelpful to talk about utilitarian psychology writ large, because it is just a lot messier than we might expect. And then, yeah, your last point, efficiency, I do think that's really interesting. And I have been working, well, we were working on this with Anne-Marie back in our Oxford days, and the project kind of died a little bit, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to revise it, in which we were looking at efficiency and maximization and uncertainty in these moral dilemmas. to try and understand the way that efficiency plays in to these decisions more concretely.
Well, thank you. If I get another chance, then we'll talk more about this topic. But I just want to say one word, Edgeworth box. Check it out. It's directly relevant to what you're doing.
Okay, great. Thank you. I will do.
We have, so I'd like to ask Leonardo maybe to ask a question before we go back to Jason, if that's okay. So Leonardo, would you mind repeating the question?
Hi, Jim, everybody. Leonardo here. Yes, I'm a computer scientist, so I know almost zero about psychology, and maybe this is a very stupid question. So the question is it possible, for example, to categorize law judges and their decisions, for example, according to these categories, as, for example, utilitarian, non-utilitarian? Because, as a data scientist, we tend to look into historical data and to kind of use this knowledge to build new things. And if that would be possible, for example, to do that, to look into, for example, historical decisions and data sets of decisions, and maybe that even would be interesting to construct robots. So many things involved. Probably people have done something related to that, but I would like to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you.
It's a fascinating question. Very interesting. So, well, the first thing I say is I think it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, or even undesirable, to categorize judges themselves as being utilitarian or non-utilitarian. And part of that is things I was just saying to Shabnam. Part of that is that there are these two dimensions. We can certainly categorize the specific judgments that the judges make as being more consistent with utilitarianism, or more consistent or more not consistent with utilitarianism. We can definitely do that. And then one area which just really comes out a lot is, for example, in judgments about sentencing, for example. So whether we say that what's more important is that we kind of rehabilitate and get people back into society, and then that can help them contribute more in future. We're not kind of wasting money on prison sentences, versus this more kind of retributive, they've done something wrong and they need to be punished. And it doesn't matter if that's like that leads to suboptimal outcomes, but they've done something wrong and they therefore need to be punished. So that's something that often comes out a lot. Or you can also see this with decisions about responsibility, which is something I'm working on at the moment in the study under review with GPs. So how they think about incorporating someone's personal responsibility into whether they're prioritized for treatment, for example. So, whether someone who smokes and is obese should be further down the list for treatment because they're seen as having this element of responsibility for their illness. Okay, so I think that you can definitely categorize these specific decisions as utilitarian or non-utilitarian, for example, in criminal punishment, but there are many other cases as well. I think it would be super interesting to look into historical decisions and how they evolved. I mean, Steven Pinker's argument does very much seem to be that over time, we've expanded the moral circle, that we've become more enlightened, that our moral concerns have shifted. And Peter Singer often talks about, the expanding moral circle, the moral circle that we used to have in ancestral environments and then through to medieval times and then post-Enlightenment. It's continually expanding to bringing more and more people, and now to include non-human sentient beings. So I think it will be really fascinating to see some work on that and documenting that through yes, that's my answer. It's a very interesting question, and that would be super interesting to do.
Okay, thank you.
Jason, do you want to ask your second question?
Sure. Remembering this distinguishing ones, forget the terms now. Interpretation, arm. Right?
I'm having
so
Jason, sorry to interrupt. I'm having trouble hearing you. I think my connection's bad or something. Would you
I'm
be able
having
to?
trouble too. So
Okay.
I think maybe
probably my
but
connection is bad.
Could you maybe
but
just type the question?
It's
he's already
number
typed it.
2.
I could read.
Number 2.
I can read it. Could you please elaborate or give us an example on the psychopathy emergence in instances of instrumental harm?
Okay, so I'm not 100% sure. So I'm probably being really dense. Exactly what this means. I think maybe what I was talking.
This came from the diagrams, if you remember, at some point, where you were distinguishing between two categories. On one side, it was instrumental harm, and on the other side, it was the impartial beneficence, and there was some plus and minuses. Pluses, yeah.
Yeah. So this is just coming from. There's a lot of. It's something that we showed with the paper in Kahane in the cognition paper. The participants who endorse sacrificial harm tend to score higher on psychopathy. So there's work showing this in subclinical psychopathy in ordinary populations. But there's also work showing that in clinical populations of psychopathy, that they also make more sacrificial utilitarian decisions. And part of that is a feature, arguably, and part of it is a bug. It's a feature in that it does sort of follow from the dual process model that if psychopaths have less emotional aversion to causing harm, they don't have this deliberation conflict that they need to resolve. They don't have the initial aversion, so that it's easier for them to just go with the utilitarian decision. It's partly a bug as well, in that this is why process dissociation was applied to moral psychology, specifically to filter out those people who are endorsing this sacrifice, not because they care about overall outcomes, but because they just don't care about hurting people. Like, you can think, if I push someone off the bridge, it's possible that I push the fat man off the bridge because I want to save the 5 people. But it's also possible that I push the fat man off the bridge because I'm just a dick. So the whole point is that you can distinguish those two out using process dissociation. And that the argument is that once you do the fancy maths, once you do the better method, that link of psychopathy and sacrificial decisions goes away because you're filtering those people out. I think my key point there was that even if that's the case for instrumental harm, it's not the case for impartial beneficence. So impartial beneficence is never positively correlated with psychopathy. It's always negative correlated or not correlated.
Thank you.
So if I may ask one last question, this results about, there seems to be different expectations for people who, when people think about interaction partners, like, do I trust a person who would behave, in a utilitarian manner? But and the fact that people, I think this is one of the coolest results. People evaluate rulers, or let's say leaders, according to different phenomena or different criteria. I'm wondering if there is a kind of an evolutionary argument here about kind of the level of selection that things are happening at. So when I'm working with on a one-on-one basis, I need to make sure that I'm working with trustworthy people in a kind of repeated one-on-one interaction, where the selection unit is myself. When I'm choosing a leader, I want the optimal decision for the group, which may be not be actually good for me in a given instant. And I'm just wondering if you know of anyone who's done kind of modeling or even just hand wavy arguments like that.
No, I can't. I have this vague recollection that there is, but I
I'm
can't
the red queen. I'll send the reference, but sorry.
Thank you.
Please, thank you, Shabnam. Yep.
I mean, this is sort of the argument that I'd like to go into, because in the JP General paper, the original inference of trust, that was very much focused on this partner choice model. It was referencing evolutionary theory and the role of partner choice in fostering cooperation. In this new political leader one, we're not talking about partner choice at all. We're kind of drawing on different literatures, but it would be fascinating to kind of incorporate those two together at these different levels. Unfortunately, I'm not sufficiently trained enough, I would say, in like evolutionary biology to really be able to make those arguments and do the kind of formal modeling that would be required for that. But I think it's very plausible and very interesting.
We have those types of people, so maybe we can.
Fingers crossed the grant works out and I can come over.
Okay, well, with this, I want to thank you again, Jim, for great presentation. I think very interesting discussion, and thank everybody for attending. Hopefully, we'll see you in Berlin sometime, and let's follow up after the afterwards, after the talk as well, with sharing references and ideas and so on. And I'm seeing lots of claps. I think I can provide one. There you go.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It was really fun, actually, to prepare the talk and to kind of go over all of this work, you know, as a whole. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Have a great
afternoon, everyone. Oh, Felicity's waving. Oh, bless. Okay, thank you, everyone. And yeah, if you have any more questions or anything you want to discuss, just shoot me an email. And have a nice Christmas. Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.